Hello and welcome to our July session of Tullie Textiles. So Tullie Textiles is a monthly session I run for Tullie House, and we meet on the second Sunday of the month. Normally on the morning I would do a Facebook Live, but this month I'm trialling something a little bit different and I'm bringing you a pre-recorded video in the hope that that will lead to slightly fewer technical issues. But I will be around on Facebook, so feel free to leave your comments, suggestions, ideas for future sessions, any questions, all of that good stuff, and I'll keep an eye on the comments and try and get back to you as soon as I can. Each month we have a look at a different technique or process or material, and this month we're going to have a look at reverse applique, as this was requested last month. It's a really nice technique to have a look at. As always, if you're watching this video when it goes out on Sunday morning, then this afternoon we have our Zoom session, and if you'd like to join us for that, you'd be very, very welcome. The details are on my Facebook page, or you can drop me a message. So in the Zoom session I've got a lovely object of the month for you to have a look at, and again we'll be having a bit of more of an in-depth look at this process, and there'll be a chance to chat to everyone and join in. So I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples of reverse applique, and then we'll get stuck in with how to do it. So this is a piece of reverse applique, and it was done on pre-printed fabric. So the birds were printed onto this fabric, and if I just give you a couple of little close-ups, what you can see hopefully is that there are cutaway areas to different fabrics. So applique is applying another fabric, it's sticking a fabric on top, so not surprisingly reverse applique is taking a fabric away, so it's a bit like cut work, and it's a really good way of using up little scraps and working in layers. So what we're basically going to be doing is we're going to make ourselves kind of a bit of a fabric sandwich, if you like. We'll be doing some stitching and some cutting and creating some lovely little samples. So say it's a really good way of using up some scraps and bits and pieces. It's a very simple technique once you get into it, and hopefully a nice relaxing way to spend your Sunday. So I'm going to move on and show you what we'll need and how to do it. So we're going to start off by just having a quick look at the tools and materials we need. We don't need a huge amount of stuff to do reverse applique, just a few bits and pieces, and as I mentioned a couple of times before, good way of using up scraps. So I'm going to use a little bit of base fabric just to make life easy, but you don't really need to do this, you can just do it with bits and pieces. But I'm going to have a base layer, I've got some scraps of fabric, I was going to say paper then, but they're not paper at all, it's fabric. So I just grabbed a handful of little bits from my scrap box, and I'm going to top mine with a bit of felt. But again, you can just use another piece of fabric, you don't need to use felt. I just quite fancy using a bit of felt today, and I quite like the colours together. I'm going to be using embroidery thread to do my stitching with. I like to use cotton perlé because I think it's got a really nice hold to it and I like the slight sheen. But any embroidery thread will work, or you could use a normal sewing cotton if you wanted to. I've also got needles and some pins, which you may or may not need. So the other thing that you're going to need, which is really important, is a pair of sharp scissors. If you've got ones with little points, that's perfect. And you may also find it useful to have a seam ripper or something like that handy. So let's get going. As I say, I'm going to work with a piece of base fabric, but you don't have to do this. If I show you some of my little samples, what I've basically got here is sort of fabric sandwiches. So I've just got bits and pieces layered up, so I don't have a particular sort of order to them. There doesn't have to be a base fabric to work from, but there can be. This is quite a thick one, so I've got quite a few layers there, but I'm still using scraps and patches. So that just gives you an idea of where we're going. So starting with my base fabric, what I'm going to do is just arrange my scraps of fabric onto my base in no particular order, to be honest. I'm just popping down bits of fabric. And how much kind of thought you give to this depends a little bit on whether there's a particular design you want to do, whether you're willing to kind of embrace the chaos and see what happens. So I think actually I'm just going to leave it at that. But again, you can keep adding layers. So you can go as thick as you like with this. Remember, you're going to have to stitch through it, so try not to kind of make mattresses. But you can use a good few scraps. So it's not necessarily about covering your base fabric if you're using one. It's getting a good selection of things that we can cut back through to. So once you've got all your scraps laid out, you'll probably want to put another layer on top. So in this instance, I'm using my bit of felt, but this could be another bit of fabric. You could continue with the scraps of fabric. I think it looks quite good to have sort of one top layer. I think it helps bring your design together, but you don't have to. It's up to you. And at this point, what you might want to do is to pop a couple of pins into your layers just to keep everything more or less together. And I'm kind of guessing where my layers are. There's no particular order to this. Regular viewers will know that I'm not a huge fan of measuring things out and planning too far in advance. I like to go with the flow a little bit. If you're not super confident with drawing, what you could with free stitching, what you could do is you could draw a shape on first, or you can just embrace the process and just start stitching a shape. So I'm going to just start stitching a shape. So I'm going to get myself a needle, and I think we'll start off with this nice pale minty colour. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my shape with stitching. Now the type of stitch you use will depend on the effect you want to get. So again, if I just show you this, I've got a back stitch for these shapes, which gives me a nice solid line which makes it easier to cut. But you could do a running stitch. So long as you do it fairly close together, a running stitch will work just fine. A blanket stitch is really nice and gives you a nice edge. You can combine stitches, just whatever you feel like doing, but I'm going to go with a back stitch, I think. And as I say, you can plan out your shape first. That was a very big stitch, wasn't it? It's because I was trying not to stab myself with that pin. Generally, stabbing yourself isn't a great start to the process, but that's okay. That's going to annoy me. I'm going to have to unpick that stitch. And one of the really great things about textiles is that if it does go wrong, this is exactly what you can do. You can just unpick and start again. So let's have another go at that. So because I've got quite a few layers of fabric here, it is quite thick, which is fine. So with backstitch, we always go back on ourselves. So I'm going in at the end of the last stitch, and I'm coming out where I want the end of the next stitch to be, and in between is the current stitch, if you like. So that's going back on itself to make that stitch. So I'm going back to that previous stitch, coming out where I want the next stitch to be. And I'm just meandering around with my back stitch. I've got no particular plan. As usual, I'm just doing quite a lot of making it up as I go along, just to show you the technique. So it's taking a little bit of time because I've got a lot of layers of fabric to go through. If you remember, I've got all those scraps of fabric under here. So it takes just a little bit of effort to get through all those layers. Just having a little look, see where I'm going with this. And as I say, there's absolutely nothing wrong with marking out your shapes first, planning what you want to do, or just making it up as you go along. Or the other thing you can do, if you're using a patterned fabric on top, it might be quite nice to use the pattern as a guide. So I've sort of done that a little bit on this one. It's got these diamond shapes on this patterned fabric, and so I've done a series of diamonds going back through the layers. So you can use your fabrics as inspiration for your shapes. All sorts of things you can do. Pom pom pom. So we're nearly finished this shape. We'll do one more stitch just to join it up. So there's my first stitch here. I'm just going to add a last stitch to join it up. So what I've got is a nice solid line which will guide my cutting. And on the back you can see I've also got a nice solid line. So I'm just going to do a knot just to secure that thread, like so. So now I've got options. What I could do is I could add other shapes inside the shapes that I've cut. I could add other shapes round and about, or I could just get stuck in and start cutting. So what I'm going to do with my nice sharp scissors is I'm going to just take away the first layer. So I'm just gently working my way in with the tip of the scissors to get going. And it is quite thick, this felt, so it's taking me a bit of time to get through, but that's okay. I'm just going to go steady. And you just sort of feel your way, really. This is where a seam ripper might be useful to get yourself started. And what I'm doing is I'm just using my stitching as a guide and just cutting away. At the moment, I'm just cutting away this top layer. I'm just cutting out the felt at the moment to reveal what's underneath. There we go. So if you remember, we made this in layers, and so you can see here I've got another shape where I've got my two patches crossing over. So what I might want to do is either add just some decorative stitching to there, or I might decide to take out this bit of blue to reveal the green underneath. So this is where working with lots of layers of scraps is nice, because you can start to make different puzzles and patterns. And I've got a bit of pink threaded up here, so I think what we might do is make another little shape and try another cut area. So same as before. This time for speed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a running stitch to make my shape. Now if I did this on just a cotton fabric, when I went to cut it, this wouldn't be very stable, because you can see there are quite big gaps between these stitches. So what I can do is I can either carry on using felt, which will give me a bit of stability because it won't fray back, or I can go in and do a double running stitch. So basically what I can do is I can go and fill in the gaps. So I've made a shape there, but to give myself a stronger edge, what I could do is go back round again, and where my stitches were on the surface, on the top surface last time, they're now going underneath, and where they were underneath, they're now going on top, to give me a solid line. So it looks like backstitch, but isn't. So if you don't like working backstitch, or you want to get your shapes in quickly, you can do it this way. So Now really the stitches I'm using here are a little bit big because we're cutting through layers. We want to try and anchor those layers together in lots of places. So really ideally my stitches would be a little bit smaller. However, for the purposes of this exercise, it will be fine. But when you're doing yours and you can pay a bit more time and attention, then try and make your stitches a little bit smaller. It will make your work much stronger because each time the needle's going through, it's joining those layers together. So the more joins you can have on there, the better, really. There we go. Just tie a knot in there. Okay, so again, I'm going to go in with my sharp scissors and I'm going to start just with the felt layer. So I'm just carefully sort of edging my way round just to take off, being careful not to snip through my stitching, just taking off that first layer. There we go. And again, you can see I've got multiple layers here. Now, I don't really want to lose all of this blue. That seems like a bit of a shame. So I think what we'll do is we'll pop another little shape in the middle. Just looking for a needle. There we go. Because otherwise, because I cut the little blue hearts out of that bit, so I don't really want to cut them all out of this shape as well. And this is where, you know, some forward planning would help, but, you know, it's also fun just to try things and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a nice little shape in the middle of this shape, which will allow me to keep some of this white and blue cotton. So again, I'm just using backstitch, and this time I'm making sure my stitches are a little bit smaller. I'm not going to go right up to the stitching on the previous shape. I'm going to leave a bit of a gap. So almost round this shape again. So what the stitching's doing is it's anchoring the fabric and it's giving you a guide for cutting. So how much kind of planning you want to put in is of course up to you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that little bit and I'm going to trim this bit. So again, going in with my scissors, trimming. And how close you trim to the stitching will depend how confident you're feeling, how sharp your scissors are, all that kind of thing. So little embroidery scissors are really good for this because they've got nice sharp points, so you can get in nice and close. There we go. So that's now starting to look a bit more interesting because I've got some different shapes underneath, and I could, if I wanted to, cut further in. I could take that bit of green out, but I quite like the way it's kind of talking through there. So that's basically how to do reverse applique. And as I say, the fun comes with playing around and trying it. So to do a quick recap, I started with a base piece of fabric, but that could be any fabric. And then I made a little sandwich with different scraps of material, just placed on top of each other with plenty of overlaps. So when I started making these stitch shapes, I can cut back through in layers. So if I just peel back, underneath this green here, I've got more colours. So what I could do is I could cut this layer back as well. So just to demonstrate, that's what I'm going to do. Sorry, I got a bit of camera shake there. And as I say, this is where you might find a seam ripper useful if you can't work the point of the scissors in. So do take your time with this, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to go right the way through. I don't want to go all the way back to the white layer, that base layer. I just want to take this bit out. There we go. A little knot of threads there. So again, I've taken another layer back, and you can see how that changes the design. So thinking about this one, this was done in different layers, and actually kind of most of the pieces were roughly the same size. So when I made these concentric shapes, I could then cut back to different layers. So you can see the different layers there. And similarly with this one, although there is slightly more of a patchwork on this one. Got different layers, and they're cut back through. You can see the edges. And again, if I show you the birds, you can see that underneath the main fabrics, the main fabric is the one that's printed with birds. And then I've got different printed fabrics underneath that I've cut back in different layers to reveal different sections. And I've added some embroidery just to finish those ones off. So it's a really nice, simple technique. Don't need much in the way of materials, don't need much in the way of fancy stitching. Just have a bit of a play, try it out, and let me know how you get on. Next month's session will be the second week in August again, I think, which, if we consult the diary, obviously should have done this beforehand, but didn't. It will be Sunday the 13th of August. Will be our next session. So if anyone's got anything they particularly want to do, any suggestions for techniques we could try, then obviously let me know. But if not, I'll hopefully see some of you on the Zoom session this afternoon if you're watching this video when it first goes out. And other than that, have a lovely month and happy stitching.